Tonight's presentation is titled Causes of Maintenance Errors, and our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is continuing in a series of Savvy webinars hosted and presented through EAA here. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management out in California. He also holds a Certified Flight Instructor certificate and an A&P Mechanic certificate with inspection authorization. He's an author for numerous aviation publications. And in 2008 was the Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year recognized by the FAA. Mike, as always, thank you so much for volunteering your time tonight to be with us and share us your information. We always love tuning in to you. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Good evening, everybody. Well, let me start off by wishing everybody a Happy New Year, a Happy 2016. We're having Tim mentioned that I'm in California, and we're having a Happy New Year in California because, as most of you may know, we have had a very serious drought here, and it has been raining cats and dogs this week. Today we had a very rare display of lightning and thunder, which is something that happens very seldom here, and actually had a power outage. So I'm hoping that we don't have a similar occurrence during the webinar. But I think that we're in a gap in the weather here, so everything should be fine. Anyway, as Tim said, we're going to be talking tonight about human error and the causes of error in aircraft maintenance. To err is human, but aviation is particularly unforgiving of human error. And specifically, when people make mistakes working on aircraft, bad things can happen. In the early days of aviation, equipment failure was a major cause of accidents, but over the years, our equipment has been getting more and more reliable to the point that nowadays about 90% of all accidents are caused by humans rather than machines. And the humans that make the error are typically pilots and mechanics. Now, most of the time, the errors are made by pilots. There have been a number of studies on this. The numbers will vary slightly from one study to another, but in general, about 80% of all accidents are pilot caused, and only about 10% of them are mechanic caused, with the remaining 10% being caused by the machine rather than human error. And as a result of the fact that most human error accidents are caused by pilot error as opposed to mechanic error, most of the efforts to improve general aviation safety have focused on pilots rather than mechanics, and appropriately so. But this has been to the extent that I think that the problem of maintenance errors has really been overlooked and is not getting enough attention. And so I've been trying to talk a little bit about the issue of maintenance errors, and I've written some articles on this, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the webinar tonight. Now, there are two basic kinds of maintenance errors. There are what I call maintenance-induced failures. Those are errors that are introduced during maintenance, where something that was working fine before the airplane went into maintenance is not working properly after the aircraft comes out of maintenance as a result of something that went wrong during the maintenance process. And I refer to these as maintenance-induced failures, or MIFs. And the other kind of maintenance error is the inspection failure. That is, when something is wrong with the airplane that should have been detected during a scheduled maintenance inspection, but is missed. And so we really have these two different kinds of errors. In effect, one an error of commission and another one of an error of omission. By far the most serious problem in my experience is the problem of maintenance-induced failures. And so I'm going to try to drill down on the causes and cures for maintenance-induced failures as we proceed here. Now, there are a number of different kinds of maintenance-induced failures. What I'm showing here on this slide is a survey that was made in the airline industry of the causes of maintenance-induced failures. And we really don't have any surveys that have been done in GA, but I would expect that in general, the distribution of errors that we see in general aviation maintenance is probably not terribly different than what we see in airline maintenance. And what we see is that the preeminent cause of maintenance-induced failures are omissions, where a mechanic failed to do something that he should have done. Next in line are incorrect installation or assembly errors, where a mechanic basically screwed up something that he was trying to do. There are various other causes, but the two that we're going to focus on here are errors of omission and errors of incorrect installation or assembly, which together account for the lion's share of maintenance-induced failures. So let's talk about omissions first. There are really two causes of omissions. One is failure to follow the manual. If you hang around as a fly on the wall in any maintenance shop and you watch A&Ps work on aircraft, you'll notice that they rarely open the book. Experienced mechanics tend to do tasks, especially familiar ones, from memory rather than by using a manual or a checklist. And human memory being as fallible as it is, sometimes when maintenance is done by memory as opposed to by following instructions, omissions get made. The other cause of omissions, and what I think is one of the biggest problems that we face, are distractions. Where somebody was in the middle of doing something, got distracted, and then basically forgot where he was and missed a step. And this is a huge problem in general aviation maintenance, because general aviation maintenance facilities, particularly the small ones where most piston aircraft maintenance is done, tend to be very distraction-rich environments. Again, if you hang around a maintenance shop for very long, think about some of the stuff that goes on that interrupts the thought process, the train of thought of mechanics. The phone rings. Customers drop by unexpectedly. The UPS and FedEx trucks come by to deliver parts that have been anxiously awaited. The Snap-on tool truck stops by to sell the mechanic the latest torque wrench or whatever it is. An FAA inspector shows up unannounced, and everything stops while everybody attends to the needs of the FAA inspector. The roach coach shows up for lunch when it wants to, not necessarily at a good breaking point for the mechanic. There are just tons of distractions that occur in small maintenance shops. I say in small maintenance shops because in large shops, typically there are specialists who deal with things like like the phone and customer visits and shipping and receiving and compliance with the FAA. And the line mechanics don't have to worry about that when we're talking about a big airline shop or a big turbine shop. But in the small shops that most GA maintenance is done in, the people who work in that shop tend to wear multiple hats, and they do whatever needs to be done. And so distractions are just a huge problem in small GA maintenance shops. Just as pilots need a sterile cockpit during high workload phases of flight, maintenance technicians need a distraction-free workplace when performing safety-critical tasks, and they don't always get it. So, distractions are a big problem, and we said the other big problem was problems with installation and assembly. And to illustrate that problem, let me show you a little picture that I came up with. This is a picture of a bolt with 8 nuts threaded onto it, and the 8 nuts are labeled A through H. And I am showing you this to illustrate a point. There is precisely one way to take this assembly apart, but there are more than 40,000 ways to put it back together, and all but one of those ways is wrong. And the point that I'm trying to illustrate with this picture is that disassembly usually constrains you to one particular sequence, with each succeeding step being prompted by the last, and the procedure is usually obvious. But assembly requires knowledge to do correctly, either in your memory or in the form of written instructions. And typically in the assembly process, there are a lot of ways to screw things up, whereas in the disassembly process, it's usually the procedure is usually pretty obvious, and there's usually only one way to do it. Now, human memory being as imperfect as it is, reassembly based on memory tends to be error-prone. Reassembly based on written guidance is a lot more reliable, but as I mentioned, if you watch mechanics at work, you'll find that they don't crack the book very often. Mechanics tend to be reluctant to consult written instructions, and they often rely on memory. And that's true of all mechanics, including yours truly. I'm guilty of the same thing. If you watch an A&P work and note how rarely he consults the manual or any other form of written guidance. Now, reassembly by memory is probably adequate for tasks that you do every day. But for less frequent tasks, it's almost inevitable for one to forget subtler details of a task after even a relatively short period of time. We as pilots should be acutely aware of that. I mean, for example, I undergo recurrent instrument training every 6 months, and you know, at the end of 6 months, when I do my instrument recurrency training, it's very obvious to me that my instrument skills have gotten a little rusty, and that they're a rapidly wasting asset, if you will. Mechanics, unfortunately, really don't get any kind of formal recurrent training. That's one of the beefs that I have with the FAA, to be honest with you, that pilots are required to go through recurrent training, at least a flight review every 2 years, and for those of us who fly instruments, instrument competency check, or at least meeting some recency of experience requirements every 6 months. But mechanics don't have any requirements like that. Mechanics very rarely, if ever, go through recurrent training to bring their knowledge and skills back up to date. And so it's very, very easy when you rely on memory to make mistakes, and frequently mistakes of omission. Improper assembly is not always obvious on subsequent inspection. If you put something together and then another set of eyes comes by and inspects the final result, frequently if an error was made during the assembly, it's not clear to the inspector because the error has been covered up in the process of assembly. So unless there's an inspector who's watching the process every step of the way, there really isn't any redundancy. The reassembly from memory often creates an opportunity for double jeopardy. On one hand, there's the probability of forgetting something important because you weren't following a checklist or following the manual, but you're trying to do it from memory. And then a decreased probability of detecting that error once the job is done and either the technician who did the work or another inspector comes and looks it over. And we'll talk a little bit more about the issue of having multiple sets of eyes a little bit later. But at this point, I'd like to change the subject a little bit and talk about levels of error. There are basically 3 levels of error that can be made in the maintenance process. One that I refer to as slips, also known as lapses, trips, and fumbles. The second known as mistakes, and the third violations. And let me define each of those. Slips or lapses or trips or fumbles are unintentional errors in execution that occurs when somebody is trying to do the right thing but screws it up somehow by omitting something, by performing something in a clumsy fashion, by doing something that he shouldn't have done, or by carrying out the right actions in the wrong order. But these are unintentional, and they're errors in the execution of what was conceived to be a correct plan of action that just went wrong. Mistakes, on the other hand, are unintentional errors in the plan itself, where it wasn't that the mechanic didn't follow the plan correctly, but the plan itself was wrong, caused because he didn't look it up, didn't perform proper research into what needed to be done, and was doing doing things wrong because he wasn't knowledgeable of the right way to do something. And finally, violations are intentional deviations from standard practices, rules, regulations, or standards, where a mechanic is knowingly cutting corners and not doing what he knows the proper procedure is, typically to save time, to taking shortcuts. And frequently after years of doing this and getting away with it, these shortcuts may become part of the mechanic's habit pattern. And then eventually they'll come back to bite him. So these 3 levels of errors are of increasing severity, if you will. The violations, which are intentional, I think are basically much less forgivable than the slips, trips, and fumbles kind of errors that everybody is capable of making, and frankly, everybody does make them from time to time. You know, nobody's perfect, and that applies to mechanics as well. We need to try to make as few errors as possible, but as long as there are humans involved in the process, we're never going to be completely error-free. So that brings us to the issue of quality assurance, and that is, how do we make sure that errors that are inevitably made by mechanics simply because they're human, and humans do make mistakes, how can we be as confident as possible that those errors will be caught and corrected before somebody gets hurt? Now, I visited lots of aircraft and engine factories, propeller factories over the years. And any time I'm within striking distance of an aircraft or aircraft engine or propeller factory, I always try to stop by and visit and see how things are done. I've also visited a number of large turbine aircraft repair stations, like the big Citation Service Center in Wichita. And I've noticed when I visit these facilities that all of them share the same fundamental work rule. And that work rule is that there must always be at least 2 sets of eyes to observe every step of the assembly process. The eyes of the technician who is performing the work, and the eyes of somebody else who is the inspector who verifies that the work was done properly. And frequently at these factories, there are more than 2 sets of eyes. Often technicians work in teams of 2, where the 2 technicians check one another's work, and then an inspector comes by and independently checks the work. So frequently in aircraft and engine factories, there are actually 3 sets of eyes watching every step of the process. And when you have 2 or 3 sets of eyes, it's pretty likely that if somebody messes up, somebody else is going to catch it, and that's important. But when you hang out around smaller piston GA shops, you don't see that. Small shops seldom can afford the luxury of having dedicated inspectors on staff that are looking over the shoulder of the technicians. At least in my experience, the lion's share of maintenance that's done on piston GA aircraft are checked by just 1 set of eyes, and those are the eyes belonging to the person who actually did the work. And when airplanes go in for inspections, like annual inspections, most of the time in the piston GA world, those inspections are done by just 1 person, 1 IA. And that's the only set of eyes that looks at the aircraft. When you have 1 set of eyes, there's the potential of missing something. So this problem of quality assurance is much more significant in the small, lean maintenance shops that work on GA aircraft than they are in aircraft factories or big turbine shops, where you have a lot of rigorous procedures, and you have a dedication to making sure that there's at least 1 extra set of eyes watching every step of the way to make sure as you can that errors are going to get caught. So let's summarize a little bit and look at some key takeaways. The most likely time to suffer a mechanical problem is on the first flight after maintenance. Anytime something on an aircraft is disassembled, repaired, overhauled, or replaced, there's a significant risk of a maintenance-induced failure. The more invasive the maintenance that's being done, the higher the risk of a maintenance-induced failure. Distractions are a major cause of MIFs, and most GA shops, especially the smaller ones where employees tend to wear multiple hats and do multiple jobs, tend to be very distraction-rich environments, and distractions are a really big problem. Also, it's important to follow the manual or to have at least a written checklist during any sort of a safety critical assembly process, and that's particularly true for tasks that are not done every day. And finally, as we just talked about, all critical assembly tasks should be checked by at least 2 sets of eyes. And in the GA world, that frequently doesn't happen. In the manufacture of aircraft and in maintenance, the large-scale maintenance facilities, it does tend to happen. But it's an area where we could use a lot of improvement. Interestingly enough, the FARs are fairly lenient in this regard. For example, I've done a little work down in Australia, and in Australia and in a number of other countries like the UK, there's a regulation that says, for instance, if the primary flight control cables of an aircraft are disconnected for any reason, there must, by regulation, be 2 separate sets of people that verify that they have been that they've been reconnected correctly, so that there isn't reverse controls or something like that. There is no such rule in the U.S. There's basically nothing in the FARs that require 2 sets of eyes on anything, and I think that's an area where maybe we in the U.S. are a little bit behind some of the other countries. Some final thoughts. Like it or not, we as owners and pilots are always the final maintenance inspector. Anytime an aircraft comes out of maintenance, the first flight out of maintenance has to be considered a test flight. It's the time that if something is going to go wrong with the equipment, that's the most likely time for it to happen. So pre-flight is as if your life depended on it, because it might, and make that first flight out of maintenance, make it as a test flight with a test pilot's mindset. Do it in day VFR conditions, don't take passengers along, and expect that something will go wrong. That's just as if you were a test pilot flying an untested piece of equipment. Because any time that aircraft has been taken apart and put back together, that's really what it is, an untested piece of equipment. And in the final analysis, you're the test pilot. So, Tim, that's all I have on this subject as far as prepared material. We can open it up for Q&A if you like.
All right, Mike, great. We've got a couple questions in here. One from John on the recurrent training that you mentioned. He says, are any insurance companies requiring or imposing on mechanics to take any sort of recurrent training?
No, not to my knowledge. And to be honest with you, I've been very surprised at that, because in the world of pilots and aircraft, I know that, for example, in order to carry liability insurance on my piston twin, my insurance company requires that I take more comprehensive recurrent training than what the minimum training required by the FARs are. And I'm really quite surprised that the insurance companies that provide comprehensive general liability insurance to maintenance shops don't similarly say, hey, if you guys want insurance, you're going to have to send your mechanics to regular recurrent training. But to the best of my knowledge, that does not happen. And they're unlike the world of pilots, where at least we have a minimum requirement to undergo recurrent training every 2 years, and if you're an instrument pilot, every 6 months. There are no regulations requiring any recurrent training for A&P mechanics. I've mentioned this before, I think, that I feel that this is really quite scandalous, and that there's no justification for it. That mechanics need recurrent training every bit as much as pilots do, but the regulations do not require it. And I really think that they should, and I think it's a big weakness in our system. But again, even if the FAA doesn't require it, you would think that the insurance companies would do so, and yet for some inexplicable reason they don't seem to place any requirements on their insureds in that regard.
Chris says, Mike, great presentation. It hits home very much because I have a mechanic that's made numerous mistakes with my aircraft. I recently found out he installed the prop wrong 6 months ago, but because he didn't follow the repair manual. The ring gear is out of correct orientation and the prop is not clocked right. It's now causing vibration. Since I can no longer trust him, what can I do? I hate having to pay someone else to fix this guy's poor performance after I've already paid him.
Well, I mean, you can you can try to shame him into correcting the error on his nickel, and if he's a mensch, so to speak, he should correct the error if you point out to him that he didn't do things by the manual. Most mechanics, if you confront them that way and you do it in a let's say a somewhat diplomatic fashion, will make things right simply because they know in their heart that if you decided to make trouble for the guy with his principal maintenance inspector at the FSDO, it could get pretty painful for him. I don't recommend that you make trouble for him with the FSDO, and I don't recommend that you even threaten to do that. But what I'm saying is that most mechanics, if they make an error and that error is quite clear and it's brought to their attention, they have a good motivation to make things right, because they don't want to get tangled up with the FAA. So I think there's a fair chance that you can get him to make it right. Now, whether you want to continue to use this guy in the future, that's a whole different issue. And if he has a history of making significant mistakes, and these sound like fairly significant ones. Everybody makes mistakes from time to time, even the very best mechanics. But the good ones make them infrequently, and the best shops try hard to get a couple of sets of eyes on anything that is safety critical, to minimize the possibility that an error will make it out the door. That's also, of course, an issue because, you know, the better QA is usually in the larger shops, but the larger shops are usually more expensive. So, you know, aircraft owners, being as we are, not anxious to spend any more money than we have to, will often opt for small shops or independent mechanics working out of the back of a pickup truck, what we call tailgaters. And if you use a tailgater, you know, by definition, you've only got one set of eyes, and the likelihood of an uncaught error is higher. There's no free lunch in aviation. Everything's a trade-off.
We've had a few questions about owner-assisted annuals, and I think Robert's question here kind of sums most of them up, so I'll ask his. Is there a significant advantage to owner-assisted annuals? If so, what should the owner do so as to minimize errors?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. I personally am a huge fan of owner-assisted annuals. and it's sort of a personal thing for me because that's how I got involved in maintenance to begin with. I was an aircraft owner for a couple of decades before I first started swinging a wrench, and I got interested in maintenance by doing an owner-assisted annual, and gradually got more and more involved, and never expected that it would take me where it took me. But I think that there is no better way to learn about your aircraft than to do an owner-assisted annual. Now, typically, an owner-assisted annual won't save you any money. It usually takes a mechanic longer to train you and coach you and keep an eye on you while you're working on the airplane under his supervision than it would for him to do the work himself. The purpose of an owner-assisted annual is typically not to save money. It's to learn. But a side advantage of owner-assisted annuals is that, in fact, there is a second set of eyes watching everything, and owners tend to ask 1,000 questions, like, well, why are we doing it this way, and that sort of thing, and that often causes the mechanics who are working with them and supervising them to be more careful and to look things up more and so on, so that they can answer those questions, and then frankly so that they can set a good example for the owner who basically is their student in a way in an owner-assisted annual. Now, some shops are amenable to doing owner-assisted annuals, working with owners in that capacity. Other shops aren't. Larger shops that are FAA repair stations frequently are precluded from allowing owner-assisted annuals because in Part 145 repair stations there are regulatory requirements as to who can swing wrenches on airplanes within the repair station, and typically it has to be somebody that's gone through certain specific training and is basically on the staff of the repair station. So if you are going to be doing an owner-assisted annual, it probably is going to be in a smaller shop or with an independent mechanic acting as your supervisor. But if it were up to me, I would almost require that every aircraft owner go through the experience of an owner-assisted annual at least once in his ownership tenure, because it is such an invaluable learning experience, and it might also reduce the likelihood of errors, simply because by definition in an owner-assisted annual you got two sets of eyes working on everything. So I think that's the best answer I can give to that question, Tim.
Mm-hmm. Robert is just wondering, don't some airplane manufacturers require training to maintain the franchise for their planes?
Well, that's a little bit complicated. The FAA has made it very clear that a manufacturer cannot levy a requirement that people who work on their airplanes go through any specified training. That's actually came up a few years ago in the context of LSAs. In fact, when some LSAs, I forget exactly which ones, the manufacturer wrote a manual that basically said to work on this airplane you have to have taken a certain course, and that was appealed to the FAA, and the FAA said no, manufacturers don't get to set the requirements on mechanics. Only the FAA gets to set requirements on mechanics. So from a regulatory standpoint, a manufacturer cannot require that mechanics go through any sort of specialized training before they can work on the aircraft. I think maybe the context of the question was a little bit different, and that is that, for example, Cirrus requires for a shop to be a Cirrus authorized service center, requires that at least a certain number of the mechanics in that shop go through a certain minimum level of Cirrus specific training provided by Cirrus in order for that shop to maintain its status as a Cirrus authorized service center. Now, anybody can work on a Cirrus, not just Cirrus authorized service centers, but in order for the service center to maintain its status as a Cirrus authorized service center, which has some advantages to it, some marketing advantages, direct access to the Cirrus parts system, and so on. The Cirrus does require that the shops, that at least a certain number of staff members in the shop go through Cirrus specialized training. I don't know for a fact whether Cessna and Piper and Mooney do the same thing or not, but at least I know for a fact that's what happens in the Cirrus world. But again, any A&P mechanic can work on a Cirrus. You don't have to be a Cirrus authorized service center to work on a Cirrus. So it's sort of a partial a partial solution, if you will. But it astonishes me how many mechanics in this country are working on equipment for which they have no specific training, and I've seen so many cases where mechanics were doing very safety critical things like overhauling engines and stuff that just literally had no experience doing it, had no business doing it in my view, and yet were perfectly within the regulations for doing it, because the regulations are very lenient in the U.S. in that regard.
I think this next question is in sharp contrast to the previous. Lyman asks, he says, my observation that many repair manuals and parts illustrations for the older GA aircraft are sadly lacking in clarity and detail, both written and illustrations. Many of the orphaned aircraft are very old airframes with non-existent or minimal manufacturer support. Wondering if you got any suggestions in that case with that type of aircraft.
Well, I agree. It is a difficult problem. I mean, just to underscore it, I own a Cessna 310 that I maintain, and my best friend in the next hangar over, up until fairly recently, owned an old Cessna 195, and I would sometimes help him work on the 195. So, and the contrast between the service manual for the 195 and the service manual for the 310, which is a much more contemporary aircraft. I guess if you can, if an aircraft that was certified in 1955 is considered contemporary, but no, the difference was between night and day, and I'm sure that even more antique airplanes than that 195, the situation would be even worse. I really can't offer much in the way of an answer to that question, other than the fact that for for these older and partially orphaned airplanes, the best hope are the type associations that exist for these aircraft, and they tend to be the best repository of information. Some of them do provide maintenance training. I did quite a bit of work with the Cessna Pilots Association, for example, and they had lots of maintenance-oriented training courses that were type specific and so on. They had some of them were oriented towards owners, but some of them were oriented towards mechanics. For example, CPA ran a rigging course for high-wing Cessnas and so on, specifically for mechanics, and maintained a roster of mechanics who had graduated from the rigging course. And so the type clubs are pretty much the best bet for aircraft like that, where the manufacturers are either non-existent or providing limited support.
Had a number of people kind of ask if you could give a few examples of each of the three levels of error.
Well, sure, I can try. For example, a situation just popped into my mind when you asked that question, Tim, of a client of mine who called one day and very agitated. He had just taken off in his Cessna 340 with his family aboard, headed off for a vacation trip in Mexico. He was based in the Houston area, and he took off on an IFR day. Airplane entered the clouds, and very shortly thereafter, all of his air data instruments, altimeter, airspeed, vertical speed indicator, everything, suddenly stopped working. And he declared an emergency and was able to make an ILS approach back into his departure airport, his home airport. Got on the ground, kind of shaken, gave me a call, and described the symptoms to me. And I responded. I said, how recently was your airplane in the avionics shop? And there was this momentary pause, and he said, well, it was in the avionics shop yesterday. How did you know? And I said, well, take it back and have the avionics technician reconnect the static line that he obviously disconnected and forgot to reconnect. The problem with the airplane, and the reason that I immediately knew what the problem was, because I'd seen this situation before, this is a pressurized aircraft, and if you disconnect the static line behind the instrument panel and forget to reconnect it, the air data instruments are now being referenced. Their static source is cabin air. And so the airplane climbs up into the clouds, and when it gets over about 1,000 feet, the pressurization system starts trying to hold the cabin at constant altitude, and of course everything stops working. And I'd seen it before, so I just instantly recognized what the problem was. But if you think about that, the avionics tech's failure to reconnect the static line that he obviously disconnected for some reason, probably to get better access to something, that was a simple slip. That was an inadvertent error of omission, the kind of thing that anybody is capable of doing. However, there is an FAR that says that any time you open the static system on an aircraft, it is required by regulation that you do a static system leak down check. And that's written right into Part 43 of the regs. And this guy obviously, he knew that he disconnected the static system. He probably didn't realize he forgot to reconnect the line. But the fact that he didn't do the static system leak down check was an intentional violation of the regs. And the way I look at it, the failure to reconnect the line is the kind of mistake that anybody can make. But the failure to do the static system leak down check, which is required by regulation, that should be a hanging offense. He ought to get in trouble for that, because that's an intentional violation, whereas the failure to reconnect the static line in the first place was unintentional. And the reason that there's a reg about static system leak down checks is to make sure that those sorts of unintentional errors of omission will get caught before they hurt anybody. This particular pilot was a very experienced pilot, and he kept his cool. But I know of at least a couple of instances where exactly the same thing happened, and it resulted in a fatal accident, including one where an airliner went down because some people taped over some static ports while they were washing the airplane and didn't untape them. So this is an important regulation, and the avionics tech obviously took a shortcut. And my guess is that he'd done that many times before and always gotten away with it, and this time it could have had tragic consequences. So that's an example that comes to mind. The other one that just popped into my head was one that was prompted by an earlier question, where one of the webinar attendees mentioned that he had a mechanic who assembled a ring gear and a prop incorrectly because he was doing it from memory and didn't consult the manual, and that's a level 2 error. That was not an unintentional screw up. That was a failure to have a proper plan. It was basically caused by trying to do something from memory rather than following the manual. And it's pretty clear that if the manual had been followed, those errors wouldn't have been made. So I think that's probably a good example of one of the level 2 errors. Does that suffice, Tim?
Yeah, no, good example. Thank you. Yes. Scott's got a question here. He's wondering, do all small repair shops have to be certified by the FAA? And if so, what type of certification do they need?
No, in general, they are not. There are basically two kinds of repair facilities. One is what's called an FAA certified repair station, or a Part 145 certified repair station. And the other is a maintenance shop that isn't a Part 145 repair station. Almost all big turbine shops are certified repair stations. The vast majority of the smaller shops that work on piston aircraft are not Part 145 repair stations. The difference is that a Part 145 repair station is a certificated entity. The repair station as a corporate entity holds a certificate from the FAA, and it as a corporate entity is responsible for what goes on. Part 145 repair stations are subject to a lot of oversight by the FAA, some quite stringent rules, whereas smaller shops that are not Part 145 do not hold a certificate. They are basically a bunch of A&P mechanics, some with inspection authorizations, that are flying in close formation. And the individual people hold FAA certificates, but the shop itself does not. The shop basically doesn't even exist as far as the FAA and the regulations are concerned, only the individuals. So if a non-repair station, if you take your airplane in there, say for an annual inspection, and it's signed off, and you have an annual signed off, the annual is being signed off by the individual IA who inspected the aircraft. It's not being signed off by the shop. The shop doesn't have a certificate. It doesn't have the authority to do anything. It's the individual IA whose name is on that logbook entry on his own behalf, and his own personal certificate is on the line. If you take that same airplane to a Part 145 repair station and the annual is signed off, it's signed off by the shop, by the repair station itself. It's obviously the signature belongs to a human being, and that human being is typically the director of maintenance of the shop, but he's not signing on his own behalf. He's signing on behalf of the shop in the same way that the president of a company can sign contracts on behalf of the company. He's not signing it on his own behalf, but as an executive of the company. So those are the two different kinds of repair facilities that we can take our aircraft to. One of which is essentially a certificate holder and is overseen and held to account by the FAA. And then non-repair stations, which represent the lion's share of shops that work on piston aircraft, which are not repair stations, do not exist as far as the FAA is concerned, and simply have a bunch of individual certificate holders working in close proximity to one another, if that makes sense. Did I lose you, Tim?
Yeah, hi, Mike. Sorry about that. So Attillo then follows it up and says, so are repair stations better in general because of that?
You know, it's like anything else in aviation. There's no clear answer to that. There are some advantages of using repair stations, and there are some disadvantages of using repair stations. And both the advantages and disadvantages come from the fact that repair stations are much more highly regulated. And just to give you a couple examples, first of all, repair stations tend to be more expensive. Why? Because they have higher overhead. This regulation isn't free. As I mentioned, you know, a repair station tends to have a full-time compliance manager who worries about, you know, dealing with the FAA all the time. The FAA makes the shop jump through all sorts of hoops and fill out all sorts of paperwork and go through all sorts of training, and none of that's free. All of that's going to be reflected in a higher shop rate. The other complication with repair stations is that there are some things that you, as an aircraft owner, might want to have done to your airplane that a mechanic is allowed to do, but a repair station isn't allowed to do. And one example of that would be, for example, well, I'll take a very personal example. On my my airplane, there's a little meter on the panel. It's a little ammeter, and it's in the propeller de-ice system. And my prop de-ice meter burned out. And so I had to figure out how I'm going to get another one. And if I go to Cessna and order a prop de-ice meter from Cessna, it's about $800. On the other hand, I was able to find the kind of de-ice ammeter that I needed from a salvage yard in Texas, and that one cost $125. Now, as a mechanic, I am perfectly within my rights to put that $125 salvage yard ammeter in the airplane, and I got it, and I tested it, and it works perfectly, and it looks like new, and it's just going to be dandy. But a repair station probably could not put that salvage yard ammeter in the airplane, because their repair station manual probably at least in most cases, requires that they only use parts that have a documented paper trail. And of course, a salvage yard part comes without any paperwork. It's as removed from probably a wrecked airplane. So that's an example where an individual mechanic or a small shop could very well install that $125 meter in your airplane. But if you went to a repair station, they would say, and correctly so, that the only thing they can do is buy one from Cessna that has paperwork associated with it, and it costs 7 times as much or whatever it is. So, like I say, it's complicated. There are advantages to repair stations, and there are some disadvantages to repair stations.
We've had a few questions here from folks who own experimental amateur-built aircraft who are repairmen for their own aircraft, and some of them indicate they've done a number of annuals on their aircraft over the years, and it's just been their set of eyes. What would you suggest for them in terms of trying to help them minimize errors that could crop up when they're doing their annuals as repairmen on their own experimentals?
Well, Tim, this is sort of out of my area of expertise because all of my experiences with certificated aircraft. But the general advice that I give owners of certificated aircraft is that it is always a good idea every few years to have an annual done by a different mechanic than the one that routinely does the annuals, just to get a different set of eyes on the airplane. Different eyes see different things. Some guys have a sixth sense about detecting corrosion in hidden places. Some guys are fantastic with engines, but not so good with airframes. People have blind spots. We see frequently that a discrepancy in an airplane has escaped detection year after year after year, and then 10 years later somebody catches it, and it's like, my goodness, why wasn't this caught 3 years ago or 5 years ago or 7 years ago? And it's the inspection process is imperfect, and it's imperfect primarily because people are involved and people are imperfect. And so the advice I generally give my clients is that it's a good idea from time to time to get a different set of eyes on the airplane by taking it in to have an annual done by somebody other than the person who has traditionally been or routinely been doing the annuals. And I suppose that the same thing would hold true for EABs. The second thing that comes to mind is that if you're annualing your RV and you've got a buddy who has an RV and has a repairman certificate for his RV, although he's not authorized to do an inspection on your aircraft and you're not authorized to do an inspection on his aircraft, it wouldn't hurt to have him hang around, look over your shoulder, because he obviously knows RVs too. And it's always a good idea to get a second set of eyes. That's pretty much all I can come up with as far as answering that question, Tim.
Yeah, it sounds like some really good advice. So just a couple comments here. Glenn just wanted to say thank you. From now on, I will be a little aware of my visits to the small maintenance shop across the street when I go to distract them and the two AMPs that are working there. And also another comment from another fellow who thought, maybe AMP mechanics ought to have their cell phones checked at the door and kept out of the toolbox area.
It is a real problem, and you know the idea of a small shop with two mechanics is a perfect example. Um, you know, those guys are going to be dealing with lots of things during the day other than uh, working on the airplanes that they're working on, and it's just inevitable. You know, a really good front office admin person who handles all the phone calls and deals with the delivery trucks and stuff like that can really help a little shop like that a lot. Some of them will spend the money on hiring somebody like that. Some of them won't. But to the extent that you can insulate the mechanics on the floor from distractions, it really pays great dividends.
Jeff says, I use the 3 flights rule after maintenance event. The first 3 flights are test flights, for my opinion. And is this too cautious, he's asking?
Well, it's pretty cautious, but I applaud the attitude. I think that's really good. You know, how many flights should be considered test flights, I think should probably be a function of what was done to the airplane. You know, to say that the first 3 flights after an oil change are test flights might be just a little bit paranoid. On the other hand, saying the first 3 flights are test flights after an engine major overhaul might not be conservative enough. You know, it really depends on how invasive the work that was done on the airplane is, and how great the risk was of that some sort of a MIF got introduced in the process.
Merrick is wondering, can a maintenance shop use non-AMP qualified personnel to work on aircraft?
Not only can they, but it's done constantly. I mean, you know, for example, in order to earn an A&P certificate, you have to have 30 months of swinging wrenches on airplanes under supervision before you can even take the test. So how do you suppose you get those 30 months? Almost every maintenance shop has uncertificated apprentice mechanics working on airplanes, and you know, building their time so that they can earn their A&P certificate. So yeah, it's extremely common for uncertified people to be working on airplanes, and in theory they're working under the supervision of a certificated person who is supervising them, and I'll quote out of the regulations, quote, to the extent necessary to ensure that the work is done correctly, close quote. But that can be pretty much anything that the supervising mechanic decides is necessary. But it happens all the time, absolutely.
I had a few questions about, you know, you indicated possibly recurrent training would be good for AMPs, so I'll ask Michael's here. I think it sums them up. Would the recurrent training you have in mind for AMPs resemble what is required, resemble what is required to maintain an inspection authorization?
Not really, and let me explain, because that's an interesting question. First of all, it is even IAs do have to renew their inspection authorization, unlike A&Ps. A&Ps get their mechanic certificate for life. Inspection authorizations have to be renewed. It used to be every year, now it's every 2 years. One way of renewing an IA is by going through an approved recurrent training course. Some IAs do it that way. Other IAs do it simply by, if you sign off 4 annual inspections a year, for example, that's all it takes to keep your IA current. You can renew on the basis of the fact that you signed off 4 annual inspections per year. So the recurrent training isn't required. But the recurrent training for IAs is recurrent training for IA stuff. And think about it, the business of an IA is inspecting. And so the IA training courses, to the extent that IAs take them, are all about inspecting and about paperwork. They're not about fixing airplanes, because IAs don't fix airplanes. A&Ps fix airplanes. IAs inspect airplanes and sign them off. So the kind of recurrent training that I think mechanics ought to have is rather different than the kinds of recurrent training that IAs sometimes get if that's the way they choose to renew their IAs. And there are all sorts of fantastic recurrent training opportunities out there. It's just that very few mechanics take advantage of them. For example, Continental Motors has a week-long training course that they do down in the factory in Mobile, Alabama, on Continental engines. I've been through that course now 3 times, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's a week-long, you know, if it were up to me, I would say that that anybody who works on a Continental engine really should have taken that course. But of course, that's not the way it works. And one of the things that was sort of eye-opening for me the first time I went there, and I've also done Cessna training courses in Wichita and some maintenance training courses in Wichita, is that when you go to these sorts of things, a disproportionate number of attendees of the course come from outside the U.S. because most countries other than the U.S. require type-specific training before a mechanic is allowed to work on something. And the U.S. doesn't require any such type-specific training. And so a disproportionate number of people who attend these training courses that are given by manufacturers are non-Americans. And that's sort of a sad commentary, I think, on the way things are here than the way things are abroad. Now, you know, don't get me wrong. I think that some of the maintenance requirements in other countries are too oppressive and draconian and cost an awful lot of money. I wouldn't want to see the U.S. Turn into Australia, for example, or the UK. But on the other hand, I think that things in the U.S. are a little too far in the opposite direction, in the direction of being a little too lax. I think the notion that somebody can earn an A&P certificate and then be legal to swing wrenches on anything from a J3 Cub to a 747 to a Black Hawk helicopter is absurd. It doesn't make sense. There ought to be at least some sort of things for mechanics that are parallel to what type ratings are for pilots. And there are in most other countries, but not in the U.S.
Interesting. Thomas just makes a comment here. He says that the FAA has a FAST program for aviation maintenance technicians, and he says this webinar is part of the one that I am doing for this year. It includes courses on human factors, accident studies, and other subjects that's important for an AMT to review.
I absolutely agree, but let me point out that for pilots, the FAA provides a rather powerful incentive for pilots to participate in the WINGS program, because if you participate in the WINGS program, you basically can get flight review credit for it. For AMTs, there really isn't an incentive other than just personal pride. for participating in the AMT program on FAAsafety.gov. I do think the FAA could do an awful lot more to promote mechanic training than what they do. And if they can do it in a non-legislative way, but one that provides an adequate incentive so that mechanics do keep their knowledge fresh and do take the trouble to go get type-specific training on the kinds of equipment that they're working on, so much the better. I'm all in favor of doing things voluntarily rather than by legislation. But from what I can see, the FAA really hasn't tried very hard and doesn't really give much attention to this area.
Andy's wondering, have you seen many mechanics use smartphones and tablets to photograph and take notes of the disassembly process of components to facilitate proper reassembly when a manual is unobtainable?
Well, certainly the use of digital cameras and now smartphone cameras has become greater and greater, and yes, I do see that more and more for sure. In aviation maintenance and literally every other phase of life.
Right.
There's nothing that happens in this world that doesn't wind up getting a picture taken of it, it seems like.
It's such a good point, though, that, before you take it apart, document what it is.
Yeah.
That way you know the way it was before you take it apart. I mean, I think it really brings up a good point there. Chris is wondering, it seems that whenever I take my plane to a mechanic, they always find something minor to fix. And of course, charge for it. But they never consult with me before they start the work. Why do they do this? And how can it be prevented?
Well, to be honest with you, that's in my view, that's the fault of the aircraft owner, not of the shop. Because as an aircraft owner, you need to lay down the rules before you turn your airplane over to a mechanic. It's interesting, and I've talked about this before, but if I take my car into an auto shop, repair shop, I am required, or the shop, I should say, is required by, well, I live in California, by California law, but I think almost every state has a similar law. The shop is required to write up a work order with written, detailed statement of work and written cost estimates, present it to me, and get my signature on it before they're allowed to pull a screwdriver out of the toolbox and start attacking my automobile. And furthermore, if anything happens in the course of the maintenance that causes it causes their charges to exceed, I think it's 10% of the estimate they gave me, they have to stop work, go back to me, explain what happened, and ask whether they have my approval for the revised estimate. There aren't any state laws about fixing airplanes, and so it's up to aircraft owners to ensure that that sort of protocol is followed. And that's a big part of the business that my company does, which is to manage maintenance for aircraft owners and ensure that the shops that work on our clients' airplanes comply with that basic protocol that says you never are allowed to do anything to one of our clients' airplanes unless you present a written estimate and get a written approval to proceed. But as I said, with cars, there are typically state laws that enforce that protocol. With planes, it's up to the aircraft owner to enforce the protocol. because the government isn't there to do it for you. I guess the theory is that airplane owners are presumed to be sophisticated enough that they can take care of themselves, and car owners are not presumed to be sophisticated enough, so somehow the government feels like it has to take care of us. But that's the way it is, and it's really up to the aircraft owner to give specific direction and say, I don't want you doing anything to my airplane until you give me a detailed written estimate and obtain my written approval in advance. And then if the shop does something that wasn't approved, you say, well, I didn't approve it, I'm not paying for it. You knew what the ground rules were, we talked about that. But a lot of owners don't do that. And frankly, for some aircraft owners, it's hard for them to take an assertive position with shops, which is why, sometimes they hire my company to do it for them. We don't have any problem doing that. We do that every day. But it's really the responsibility of the aircraft owner to lay down the ground rules.
And you did do a webinar on that about, what was it, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, I guess, on owners' responsibilities, and you talked in detail about this. So maybe
I think it might have been longer ago than that, Tim. I know time flies.
I know time flies. Yeah. But you can always go back into the archive. Whoever asked that question, and look for that previous video of the webinar that Mike did,
yeah.
and I know you went into great, excellent detail about it. So, well, Mike, thank you so much. We're bumping up against the edge of the time here. Great job tonight. I know we've had a number of comments from attendees. Great job tonight. On the meter, it looked like it had to be around 600 people that were logged in tonight. So really good turnout for the
good way to start the new year, huh?
Yeah, you betcha. Yeah, really good. So please just take a few moments and share your closing thoughts with everybody.
Okay, well, I just wanted to go over the next few first Wednesday of the month webinars. The one in February is called The Lost Art of Repair, and I'll be talking about the fact that we don't have to replace parts on airplanes all the time. We can repair the old ones, and that is something that is tending to get lost nowadays when so many shops and mechanics are kind of spring-loaded to the replacement position. On March 2nd, the webinar is called Fix It Now or Fix It Later. We're going to be dealing with the question of what happens when you're off on a trip away from home and something goes wrong with your airplane. How do you make a rational decision as to whether it is safe or legal or both to defer fixing the problem until you get home, and how do you decide when it's going to be necessary to fix the airplane on the road, which is always a somewhat traumatic thing for plane owners, because they're dealing with strange shops and strange people and so on. And finally, in April, webinar is called Watch Your Language. We're going to be talking about the meaning of various kinds of maintenance terms, things like the difference between repair, overhaul, and rebuild, and how important it is to use words accurately when you're asking to have maintenance done on an aircraft. So those are the next 3 webinars coming up. And finally, just want to invite anybody who isn't already on the list to sign up for my free monthly email newsletter that comes out once a month on maintenance topics and other interesting kinds of things. You can sign up either by going to savvyaviator.com and signing up, or sticking around for the post-webinar survey that Tim's going to be putting up, saying all sorts of nice things about how much you like this webinar and checking the checkbox to put yourself on the mailing list. And finally, if you haven't already done so, take a look at Amazon for my book Manifesto, in which I talk about my maintenance philosophy. And Tim, that's all I have for tonight. And I guess just finally, a Happy New Year to everybody, and we'll see you all next month.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you so much again for sharing your time with us tonight and keeping on your series of enlightenment. Much appreciated. And to all the attendees that tuned in tonight, thank you all so much for tuning in. And we hope you can tune in next week where we continue the webinar series. Have a great night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.